The Centurion's Oath. The Soldier's Household. Caesarea. Maritima glittered like a coin pressed hard into the coast, Rome's face stamped over Judea. The long white knuckle of the aqueduct reached toward the city like a promise that water and power would never run dry. Drums from the garrison marked the hours. Fishmongers bargained in 3 languages beneath awnings strung with salt-stiff nets. The Jews kept their distance from the amphitheatre's laughter, and the amphitheatre returned the favour. The city lived like conjoined twins, never quite at ease, always braced for a flinch. Cornelius knew the tremor beneath the marble. A centurion of the Italian cohort, he was the spine of his 80 men, whose sandals kept time with his step, whose discipline copied his own. He wore authority the way a veteran wears scars, without boasting, without apology. The vine staff at his hip had ended more arguments than his sword ever needed to. He was the officer the prefect sent when an alley dispute risked becoming a street, when a street threatened to turn into a riot. And yet, among the men, there was a rumor that he never struck hard when a word would do, that he listened before he judged, that he was just. Justice, to Cornelius, had never been a Roman ornament hung on the empire to make it handsome. It was a weight. He had felt it first in small ways, the way a widow's eyes followed the bread he left at a door, the way a child's hand warmed in his after a scuffle at the market, the way a frightened merchant's voice steadied when a soldier stood between him and greed. He lived as Romans of rank lived, with a house that could stand on its own if the world fell. The villa was not grand, but it was orderly. It had a rectangular courtyard with a laurel in a bronze pot, a small shrine alcove emptied of household idols, a colonnade shadowed in the heat of noon. Servants moved with practiced silence, a hand across a jar to keep it from chattering against its neck, a folded cloth, a door eased closed. Soldiers from his contubernium, men trusted enough to eat within the walls, came and went like older sons. In Rome, a man's gods were the house's gods. In this house the master had done something every neighbour could describe and none could explain. He had put out the lamps before the images and let the alcove go dark. He had not thrown out Rome, he had not thrown out himself. He had, instead, begun to do as Jews did, without the badge, without the boundary marks, standing in the back at synagogue, nodding at the sound of the psalms as if recognizing a melody in a language he had not been taught. The word the elders used for him was respectful, but precise, God-fearer. His men joked in the way soldiers do when something unsettles them and they want to turn it into something they can hold. Our centurion, one would say, speaks to a God who doesn't drink wine. Another said, he's defected to the synagogue, they'll have him wearing tassels by winter. But when the 9th hour came and Cornelius stilled his house for prayer, no one laughed. The quiet he kept was not the quiet of empty rooms but of attention. Servants paused with water pitchers still lifted. A soldier, halfway through buckling his cuirass, held the strap against his palm and waited. Even the laurel in its pot seemed to lean toward the hush. Duty followed him down to the barracks each morning. He inspected sandals, ran a thumb along the edge of a javelin's head, corrected a slack posture with the tap of the vine staff, issued rations and counsel, listened to the centesimus complaints of men who had perfected the craft of complaining. He drilled them because a drilled soldier lives longer. He punished because a punished soldier learns before a dying soldier does. Rome paid him to keep order. He found that in himself there was another order being kept, the tilt of his life toward a God whose commandments he did not yet dare to claim, whose people he wished to honor without pretending to be what he was not. On market days he sent a boy ahead with 2 baskets, one for the baker whose wife lay sick, one for the widow whose son sold figs with a smile too bright for hunger. He did not write his name on the gifts. Names, he had learned, are loud. Mercy does its best work when it does not have to shout. Sometimes a synagogue elder would catch his eye in the crowd and incline his head, a small bow, given as if it might be taken back if used too boldly. Sometimes a Roman acquaintance would ask whether Cornelius had grown ashamed of the household gods. He would answer, "I have learned the name of one who needs no statue to stand." Even so, he was still only on the edges. The Jews would not invite him further in. The Romans would not pull him fully back. Children in the street called him Centurion in Greek and Lord in Latin and Sir in Aramaic, as if each tongue wanted to claim a portion, and none could take him whole. He bore it without complaint. A soldier keeps the ground assigned to him. Cornelius kept the ground between worlds, not as a man who loved fences, but as one who felt that the pasture beyond them was wide. What pushed him forward was not a plan, but a prayer that would not stop. He had begun with courtesy, standing because the Jews stood, fasting because they fasted, learning the hour when the incense rose in Jerusalem so that his own whisper might rise with it. Then slowly, courtesy had become necessity. A day without that hour in his courtyard felt wrenching. A gift not given felt like a command not kept. He had never heard a voice in his house. He had never seen a sign that would satisfy a skeptic. He had instead an ache that was both hunger and food, both question and its single-word answer. Come, the Apostles' vision. Joppa was no Caesarea. The city smelled of tar and salt, the harbour a tangle of ropes and gulls, its streets narrow, uneven, littered with fish scales and the shouting of traders. Here the sea's labour was worn into men's hands and women's backs, and life felt more ancient, less polished than the marble port built by Herod to the north. Yet Joppa had its own claim to story. Jonah had fled its waters once, running from a god who refused to hate the people Jonah hated. Now another fisherman stood at its edge, called into a storm he did not yet recognize. Simon Peter lodged in the house of Simon the tanner. He stayed there without shame, as though his heart were already being prepared for something larger. It was the 6th hour, midday. Hunger gnawed at him while food was being prepared below. He went up to the flat roof, the sea wind tugging his cloak, the sunlight pressing against his eyes. He prayed, as he always prayed, words steady, inherited from the rhythms of temple and synagogue. But as his voice fell into silence, something in the air seemed to still with him. The shimmer of the sea blurred, the hum of servants faded. It was as though the world itself had drawn breath and held it. He saw a sheet, vast as a sail, descending from heaven, its corners gripped by hands unseen. Upon it were creatures of every kind, beasts with cloven hooves, birds that tore flesh, reptiles that slid cold across the surface. The sight alone made his throat tighten with revulsion. Then came a voice, clear and commanding, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." Peter recoiled as if struck. "By no means, Lord. I have never eaten anything common or unclean." The voice replied, "What God has cleansed, you must not call common." It came 3 times, pressing against the walls of his resistance, undoing with patience what years of training had set in stone. 3 times the vision unfolded, 3 times Peter refused, 3 times the voice persisted, and then the sheet was drawn back into heaven. Peter staggered as the trance ended, staring at the tiles beneath his feet. Was this a test? A parable? A command to abandon what made Israel distinct? His stomach twisted, not from hunger this time, but from confusion. He had walked with Jesus long enough to remember his words. Nothing that goes into a man defiles him, but what comes out from the heart. He had seen the Lord sit at tables with tax collectors, speak with Samaritans, lay hands on lepers without fear. Yet the thought of eating what had always been unclean tore against everything he had been. He prayed again, this time not with words, but with bewilderment. The rooftop became a battlefield of obedience and hesitation. Even as he wrestled, voices rose from the street below. He heard unfamiliar accents, the cadence of Gentile speech. At the gate of Simon, the tanner's house, stood 3 men, 2 servants and a soldier. Their sandals were caked with dust, their eyes steady but cautious. They asked for Peter by name. The Spirit whispered within him, quiet but unyielding, "Behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down. Accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them." Peter descended. The household stirred uneasily at the sight of the men. Gentiles, and one a soldier in Rome's service. It was not custom for them to enter a Jewish home. Suspicion flickered across the faces of the believers who had gathered in Joppa. But Peter, still carrying the weight of the vision, stood at the threshold and listened. The men bowed slightly. One spoke. Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man, well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to hear what you have to say. The name hung in the air like a drawn breath. A centurion, a Roman. Yet not a mocker, not an oppressor, but one praised even by Jews. And an angel had spoken to him. Something in Peter's spirit aligned, though not yet fully understood. He remembered again the sheet, the voice, the command not to call common what God had cleansed. Perhaps this was the meaning. Perhaps the unclean were not beasts, but people long kept outside. Peter invited them inside, Gentiles, under a Jewish roof. Strangers offered food and rest. That night, the house breathed with unease. Jewish companions whispered in corners, uncertain what Peter intended. The Gentile messengers sat apart, respectful, but their presence alone reminded all of the gap between them. Peter lay awake, the words of the vision echoing, "What God has cleansed, you must not call common." At dawn he rose and ensured that things were prepared. The men of Cornelius would return to Caesarea, and Peter would go with them, not out of curiosity, but conviction. The voice of the Spirit still burned within him. Go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them. He could not explain the command, but disobedience felt unthinkable. Yet he was not reckless. Some of the brothers from Joppa would go too, both as witnesses and as companions. If this was truly of God, they must see it with their own eyes. If he had misheard heaven, they would stand beside him when questions came. Together they set out along the coastal road, the sea wind pressing against their cloaks, carrying the brine and pitch of the harbour. Each step northward pulled them farther from certainty, toward a Roman city, a Gentile household, and a meeting that could either divide the church or make it whole. The journey stretched 2 days, the Mediterranean beating against the shore to their left. As they walked, silence often weighed heavier than speech. The Jewish companions kept their distance from the Gentile messengers, but the road would not allow them to stay apart forever. At night, when they stopped to rest, bread was broken between those who had started as strangers. Hesitant at first, then practical. Hunger overcame prejudice. Peter pondered with every step. He remembered the Lord's final words before his ascension. "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." The phrase had always seemed vast, far off. Now, with a soldier walking beside him, he felt its weight. The ends of the earth might begin here. The encounter. Meanwhile, in Caesarea, Cornelius was preparing. His household knew the centurion's command was not to be taken lightly. Friends and relatives were summoned. Soldiers, he trusted, gathered quietly. The villa filled not with the noise of festival, but with the hush of expectation. Lamps were trimmed, though it was day, cushions arranged, doors left open to welcome guests. Cornelius prayed, then ordered his men to keep watch for Peter's arrival. 2 processions were moving toward collision, the fisherman from Galilee, uncertain but obedient, the centurion of Rome, waiting with faith sharpened by vision. Between them hung centuries of division, imagined and unimagined. Cornelius had risen early. He polished his armor, though he did not plan to wear it, trimmed his beard, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He moved through his villa as a man preparing for battle, but the weapons of this day were expectation and obedience, An angel had spoken. A man named Peter was coming. Cornelius knew little more than this, but little more was needed. He had summoned not only his household, but also relatives and trusted friends. Some came out of loyalty, some from curiosity. A few soldiers in his command, men who had followed him into prayer before, stood in the courtyard with disciplined patience. Servants moved quietly, preparing benches, sweeping the tiles, refilling lamps though daylight still shone. The villa filled with a murmur of anticipation, a hushed chorus of, "What will he say?" and "What will happen?" Cornelius answered them only once. "We will see. It is the Lord's doing, not mine." When word came that Peter was near, Cornelius's heart struck against his ribs like a drum. He hurried to the outer court, and when Peter stepped across the threshold, Cornelius fell at his feet. For a centurion to bow before a Galilean fisherman was an image Rome would have mocked, but here, before God, it was right. Peter startled and bent to lift him. "Stand up, I too am a man." His words were steady, neither harsh nor indulgent. He would not accept worship. He would not allow himself to be mistaken for more than a servant. The gospel did not elevate one man over another. Cornelius rose, and together they entered. The crowd hushed, all eyes fixed on Peter. Cornelius spoke. "4 days ago, at this very hour, I was in prayer in my house. Suddenly a man stood before me in shining garments and said, 'Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, your alms remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and ask for Simon who is called Peter. I sent for you at once, and you have done well to come. Now therefore we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord.'" The words hung like incense, filling the room with reverence. Peter stood silent for a moment, surveying the faces before him, Romans and Greeks, soldiers and servants, men and women, young and old. Their eyes were open, expectant, and in that moment the sheet descending from heaven returned to his mind. What God has cleansed, do not call common. He understood. This was not about animals, this was about people. He lifted his voice. "Truly I understand that God shows no partiality. In every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." A murmur rippled through the crowd. For Romans who lived in a world of rank and privilege, where every title determined worth, these words were electric. Before God, the centurion and the servant, the officer and the widow, stood alike. Peter continued, his voice carrying like a wave. "The word that God sent to Israel, preaching good news of peace through Jesus Christ, he is Lord of all. You yourselves know. You heard what was done throughout Judea, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power. He went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. They put him to death by hanging him, but God raised him on the 3rd day and made him appear to us, chosen witnesses, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead." Epilogue. The open door. The sea still broke against Caesarea's harbour stones, steady as breath, indifferent to men's wars and prayers. Roman banners still lifted in the wind above the garrison, and magistrates still scribbled decrees in Latin ink, believing their words would outlast generations. But in one villa by the shore, a quieter inscription had been made, not on marble, not on bronze, but on hearts. Cornelius rose each morning as he always had, the soldier's habit too deep to unlearn. Armour polished, sandals strapped, orders given. Yet now his first act was not inspection, but prayer. His house moved with him. Servants who once bowed only out of fear now sang with him in psalms. Soldiers who once followed his barked commands now learned to listen when he read aloud the words of the prophets. The same voice that once carried orders down a line of spears now carried the name of Jesus into rooms that had never heard it spoken. He did not resign his post nor flee from Rome's service. He remained where God had placed him, bearing witness not by leaving the empire but by outlasting it. His authority was unchanged, but its root had shifted. No longer only a centurion of Caesar, he was now a servant of Christ. The empire's eagle still spread its wings above his cohort, but Cornelius's allegiance was fixed higher to a Lord who needed no banners. When Paul later preached to Greeks, Syrians and Romans, he would find footing in the memory of a centurion's household where heaven itself had testified. Cornelius became precedent, a living proof that the promise was for all who are far off. And what of his prayers? The angel had called them a memorial before God. Now, in the memory of the church, they remained that still. Each household that gathered in secret, each Gentile convert who heard of Jesus and believed, could trace the line back to Cornelius bending at the 9th hour, whispering to a God he barely knew, aching for clarity. His whispered petitions had become a doorway for nations. The scriptures that would one day be bound in leather and carried across continents already bore his fingerprints, faint but sure. When Luke wrote Acts, he carried Cornelius's story forward, not as ornament, but as growth. For the faith that began among fishermen did not end there. It marched in sandals and spoke in tongues not its own. It crossed thresholds once thought forbidden. It learned to call foreign men brothers and strange lands home. And in the quiet corners of Caesarea, where waves still kissed the harbour stones, there lingered the echo of a centurion's prayer, and the sound of a door left open. The end.